Hello students. Today we're going to kind of change things up a little bit. Um, we're just going to cover a few concepts in this tutorial, and we're going to start once again with our default cube, and once again I'm using the cycles render engine. So just kind of one of the problems with CGI over the years is that it can look a little too perfect to be believable. And for those of you who are taking my class, you'll know that I draw a distinction between realistic and believable, and what we're generally going for is believable. So this cube, for instance, would have a really hard time existing in the real world because it is so sharp on the edges. So what you can do to fix that is you can add a little bit of roundness. So if we tab into edit mode on this cube, we can bevel the edges a little bit, and we've got all kinds of tools over here, but I like to use the keyboard shortcut, so I'm going to use Control B, and if I have everything selected, then I can just move my mouse to create kind of a beveled edge, and you can see that that's not a very detailed beveled edge. If I want more detail, then I can scroll with my mouse wheel to add more bevels to it. Or I can scroll up to add detail and down to remove subdivision. So that's one method of adding a bevel to an object. I'm going to tab out of edit mode here. I'm back in object mode, you can see. And I'm going to show you another method of adding a bevel to an object, and that is to use what's called the modifier stack. The modifier stack is it's kind of one of your common go-to tool areas in Blender. It's represented by this little wrench over here. You can see I can add a modifier to my selected object, and a modifier is really cool because they're non-destructive. They alter the geometry. They basically add some sort of math to the geometry that I'm working with to make it look or act differently. But at the end of the day, I can actually remove the modifiers. I can stack them on top of each other to have one modifier affect the result of another modifier. But let me just kind of show you what I'm talking about here. So if I open my modifiers menu here, you can see that under generate I have a bevel option here as well. And if I click on that, then my cube is beveled. And I don't have the same controls. I'm not going to control it by dragging my mouse around or scrolling with my wheel. But over here I can just type in kind of what I want. The amount of bevel. I can increase or decrease that, and the number of segments. So in other words, the amount of detail. I can increase or decrease that here. And in the end, if I don't like my result there, I don't have to undo or anything. I can just delete the modifier with this little X button, and it goes away, and I'm left with my original cube unmodified. It's a non-destructive form of editing my geometry, and that's kind of your first intro to the modifier stack. So I'm going to delete my default cube here, and we're actually going to create something kind of new. So I'm going to tap 5 on my number pad. That will change my viewport to an orthographic viewport, which means basically it's not trying to simulate perspective with a vanishing point. Then I'm going to tap 1 on my number pad, and again, that's the 10 key off to the right on an extended keyboard, not above the QWERTY, the letters. The numbers up above the letters won't do this unless you set that to do so in your preferences. So now I'm looking through a front view, a front orthographic view. I've got 1 for front, 3 for right, 7 for top. And if I want to look at the opposite of any of those, back, left, or bottom, I just tap 9. And now I'm looking at the bottom of my view. There's nothing in it, so that's kind of a disorienting, sort of an odd thing. But let's go back to the front view, and I'm going to add, so Shift A, I'm going to add a curve, and we're just going to use a Bezier curve here. And that just looks like a straight line until I tumble my view. I'm going to have to rotate this, because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a vase. I'm kind of going to treat this like a pottery wheel. So let's rotate this in Y by 90, RY90. You can see that that's standing up now, but it still looks pretty flat from my front view. So now I'm going to rotate in Z by 90, RZ90, enter. Okay, and now from a front view you can see I've got some depth to it. So I'm going to tab into edit mode at this point, and I haven't moved it from that central view. But now I can select, just like with a cube or another mesh object, with this Bezier curve, I can select the individual components. So I'm going to select this anchor point here and tap G to move it. Then I'm going to select this one down here and tap G, and I'm just going to move that out in X. And that's looking pretty good. So I need more detail here, more geometry, so I'm going to select this anchor point and tap E to extrude and kind of bring that down here, and I'm going to play with these anchor points to kind of make this into something more like what I want the cross section of my pot to look like. And you know what, I might select these two anchor points. If you hold down Shift, you can select multiples. I'm going to right click and click Subdivide, and that'll give me a new anchor point kind of in the middle so that I can add some extra detail here. Okay, and I guess we shouldn't get too caught up in lots of detail because we want to keep this tutorial short. Short little span of attention. Okay, extrude in X. We're going to bring this over to the middle, extrude in X. That's EX on the keyboard. And then GZ to bring that down. GZ to bring that all the way up. We'll just kind of flatten out this. We're just going to eyeball it. Kind of going to flatten out this bottom here. Okay, and I'm going to say that's probably good for the profile of my pot. So basically I've just kind of made the cross section of half of it, and at this point I'm ready to spin this thing. So I'm going to come over here to my Modifier Stack, and I'm going to choose the, let's see if I can find it. Oh, it's called Screw in Blender, which it's debatable as to whether or not that's a good name. In certain social circles it's probably not. And you can see that this made a really super weird, like not pottery shape basically, and that's because we are spinning around the wrong axis. So let's change that to our x-axis, and now you can see that that made a pot, a kind of cool looking pot with our profile. Okay, so we also have controls over here. How many steps, for instance, does this take to go around the circle? You can see that that's not very high resolution, so I'm going to quadruple that to 64 steps. And I have to be careful because that's smoothed it way out in my viewport, but you can see that it's still set to render just 16 steps. So let's change that to 64 as well. You want to be careful not to put your numbers too high over here, because that can be really, you can eat up your memory really fast if you do that. Okay, so I'm going to call this good for my pot, and now I'm going to right click on it. Well, first let me show you something. If I tab into edit mode on this thing, you can see that it's not showing me my familiar edges and vertices and faces like edit mode does on a mesh object. But if I go to my wireframe view, so tap Z and click wireframe, or click wireframe button up here, then I can still actually edit my original Bezier curve. And I can turn the visibility, if I click this little monitor here, I can turn the visibility of the modifier off so that I'm just looking at that original Bezier curve. And you know, if I decide, hey, I really think that this pot should flare out a little more on the sides, then I can just make that change right here, And since the actual thickness, the walls, are just a modifier on this Bezier curve, the moment I turn that modifier back on, it will reflect my changes. So you can see that that's a much wider pot now. I kind of made a peak in the middle, but we're running out of time, so I'm going to show you another couple of things. Let's turn our resolution back down a little bit, 16, and I'm going to also add a Subdivision Surface modifier, and you can see that that smooths things out as well. And what that does, if I change my viewport and my render levels both to 2, that's really nice and smooth looking. What that does is that just basically takes any angles and draws kind of a couple of extra steps to sort of approximate an arc between them. And if you do that with enough levels, then it looks really smooth and curvy instead of blocky. Alright, so let's see if we can make something out of this. First of all, I need to put a material on it. So in order to make things easy on myself here, I'm going to I'm going to tap F3. And if I type convert in here, then you can see I convert this to a mesh object. If you can't remember that, F3 is to search through the commands. You can also go to the object menu, and there's a convert menu up here where you can convert it to a mesh. Okay, and that allows me to tab into edit mode, and now I can see, you see I've got faces, and I can extrude and do all the weird mesh things that we are kind of used to with meshes. So this is now a mesh object. So I would like to add a material to it to make it look cool, and I'm going to do that by going into my shading workspace. And you can see here that this has given me kind of a whole new view of things. I'm in a material preview viewport here, and I'm going to go down to my materials and add a material to this object. We're just going to call this pottery. We're going to create what's called a procedural material, which means that Blender is just going to generate the material and it's not dependent on any external files for its existence. So by default, Blender gives us this principled shader. You can see this node down here, and it's also represented over here on the right. The node editor might seem a little daunting at first, but it's a much better way to approach these shaders in the long run, because they can get complicated if you really start getting creative. So I've got an add menu here, just like we're used to, and I can also just hit Shift A. So I'm going to add a texture here, and I'm just going to make it a noise texture. And you can see I have a color output and a factor output, and if I plug this color output into the base color of my material over here, then you can see after a minute it updates, and it just kind of has created this colored noise pattern. If I just plug the factor into that base color, then you can see that it's going to give me a grayscale sort of representation of about the same thing. And I have the ability here to change this the look of this texture. But before I do mess around with anything in there, I actually kind of like the look of this. You know, I can change the scale and the detail level. I actually kind of like the look of this, but I wish I had a little more contrast in it. So I'm going to go under add and color, and I've got a brightness and contrast node here that I can just pop right into the middle there. And I'm just going to push my contrast up a little bit, and you can kind of see what that does. Okay, so that's starting to look kind of fun, sort of marbly. I can play around with that in a lot of different ways, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to do a couple more things. I'm going to take my roughness down so that you can see it will start to reflect, kind of give me some gloss there, and that's really nice. And then I'm going to light this scene. So I'm going to go back to my normal layout here, and since this was a default scene, I already have a light. Let's look at a rendered view really quick and just kind of see what things look like. As always, I like to add a floor, GZ -1. We'll put it directly under my object here. So that's kind of nice. And we've got our lights here, but I would like to light with 2 lights. So I can either add a light or I can duplicate this object. Now the shortcut to duplicate an object is just Shift D. And I can drag this one over here, and let's play with these a little bit. I'm going to click on this light and we're going to go into its light properties, and you can see that this light has a power rating and a color. So I'm going to change this light to kind of blue, and I'm going to change this other one to kind of be maybe, well, you know, let's go red. Let's stick on kind of opposite ends of the color wheel a little bit, maybe a little into the orange, orangish red, and that's kind of cool looking. So Shift D allowed me to duplicate that light, and there's one more thing I'm going to show you here, even though we're technically a little bit over time already. I'm going to show you how to make one more type of shader, and that's going to be with a material. So I'm going to add one more plane here and move this thing up, and I'm going to turn this plane into a softbox, which is a type of light that photographers use quite a bit. And I could just use an area light for this, but if I want it to actually show up in my rendered view, this is the way I need to do it. So if I click on my materials tab over here, click new material, and we're going to call this softbox, then instead of a principled shader, I'm going to change this to an emission shader, and it now emits light, and it has some of the same controls as a light does. You know, it's got its strength and its color. So if I look at this object now through my camera, you can see that that's looking pretty cool. And I've sort of eliminated my shadows, so I think I could improve this a lot, but those are the basic principles that I wanted to get through in this tutorial. I apologize that it's been a little longer than the others. Thanks for bearing with me, and I hope this is helpful.